So I'm with Jerry Garfman. He is my uncle, and we're talking history. We're in Kingston, New York, and we're talking history of the city and where he grew up. So you're from Cripplebush, or you a little bit north?
Lyonsville.
Lyonsville.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's real
Just
near.
above Cripplebush.
So what is that near? Is that in the middle of the country?
That's probably about about 25 miles to Kingston, outside of Kingston.
And grew up farming?
Grew up
You're
on
a
a
farming
farm
kid?
in Lyonsville, yeah.
Okay. And we talked about the history of Kingston and that they made bricks. And
That's
they had
correct.
the big fire in Manhattan, like 1840 so in there. And then they changed all the building codes, and then no more wood. So they had to get bricks and bluestone from this area around here.
The bluestone industry, yeah, and brick industry in Kingston, and the bluestone in Sampsonville, New York, and surrounding area.
And we were talking, and so we have a love of history, and you were talking about your youth growing up, and that you were an orphan train kid.
Well,
Not exactly an orphan
not
train kid,
exactly.
but you were grew up in New
Foster
York City.
child by fostered out of New York City by Children's Aid Society of New York.
So when you told me that, I immediately remembered that from the movie Orphan Train,
Yes.
and the book.
Yeah.
Was that Linda? I'll put that in the bottom. The author of the Orphan Train, and that I went and did some research about the Children's Aid Society, and that they are from the 1850s to 1930s in there.
Yes,
And that
as far as I know, yes.
they took kids from the city. They
Mhm.
Pastor Brace was one of the founding members, and he was doing a mission in the Five Points in New York City, and thought that the kids would be better off being placed out in the country. And so I was thinking of comparing that with your experiences. Like, so you were born in New York City. When did you leave the city, and were you placed?
Oh golly, let's see. That would be 2, 3, probably closer to 1944.
1944.
Yeah, I was born in 41, and I was about 2.5 when I came up here in the country to be fostered out on a farm, and that was probably, I was about 2.5 then.
So some of the things I was wondering from the movie, there talked about the feeling of the kids being removed from what they knew,
Mm-hmm.
and the experience of being taken, to a foreign kind of environment for them. You said you were about 2.5 years old when you came,
Yes.
and you had an older brother.
Yeah, he was 4 years older than me, and to clarify, I don't remember too much before I went to the country and while I was there on the farm until a little bit later on. Some of the things kind of gelled, but actually we ended up in a institution which was called the Shelter, which was
Right.
located in Queens, New York. And then from there, ended up at a place in Staten Island, which was called Goodhue. And I think that had some kind of indirect affiliation with a Catholic group there. I'm not sure.
Okay. So I was interested in how you felt being, removed from one environment to the other. And so what was it like for you growing up on a farm?
Well, it was very busy.
Right.
And when we first got there, and the same as my brother, really enjoyed the animal life that was around us, the cows and chickens and pigs and all the things that you would probably experience now at a fair, but it wasn't quite the same. And we soon learned that we would have certain chores or duties to carry out at the farm. My brother mostly, because he was older than I, and I kind of grew up into the responsibilities of the farm over time.
Yeah, I've got some family who are dairy farmers up near Syracuse, and they're the hardest working people I've ever met. You know, there's no time off really in
None.
farm work.
No, there's no time. Even when my foster father, foster mother would be sick, they would manage to carry out their duties, and unless they were really dangerously sick. But we were a combination. We had dairy, about 18, 20 head of cattle, milking cows, Holsteins mostly, and then we had chickens, and there was upwards of maybe 1,200 chickens, which was a lot back then. And then usually 2 pigs, and that was the extent of our animal raising of animals on the farm. And of course the pigs came to be our food supply.
Okay. When I looked back through the history of the Children's Aid Society, they've done some surveys, and usually the results are pretty good. People seem to be better off than they would have been if they were just left in a system in New York City. But some of the criticisms they talked about were, they were taking children from the city and just taking them out to the country and just as labor, and some kids went out and they found wonderful family life. Some were shopkeepers' kids, other kids were farmers' kids.
Yeah.
So how do you think you fared?
I think my brother and I fared, although it was very tough at times, having the responsibility of chores every day, and of course that got heavier and heavier burden as you got older. That part also taught a responsibility, but it kind of put a squash on any kind of activities outside of the farm. My brother and I didn't get involved in school baseball or basketball or anything like that, because obviously we had to be home at a certain time at the end of the day. So after school, we would have to take care of chores, feeding the animals, milking, and egg pickups and those sorts of things. So it did it did affect our freedom to be a kid sometimes.
Just
more
listening,
times than not.
yeah, listening to your story, you worked very hard.
Yes, very.
Very
Yes.
hard, and you. So how did you feel? Did you feel like you were just a regular, a full member of the family, doing your part, working as hard as everybody else, or do you think that you had higher burdens on you because of that you were coming from the city and you weren't actually born in that family?
Well, the family did treat us nicely, and they did incorporate us into the family functions, whatever they were, Christmas time. And we did end up with a foster grandmother who was very kind, very loving. And as far as being loved by our foster parents. I was pretty sure of the love that my foster mother gave us, but a little uncertain about my foster father, but that maybe had something to do with his upbringing, not showing his emotions readily.
Time frame.
Yeah.
What I so I went back and looked at the Children's Aid Society, and their beginning goals were work, education, and family,
Uh-huh.
and using those to build self-reliant citizens. And I was just thinking about like raising my kids. They're 21 now, and I think the goal wasn't self-reliant citizens. Was as the kid happy, and you know, so you weren't raised a snowflake. I understand that because you have some metal to you. Just talking about when your early married life, you carrying 2 or 3 jobs.
Yes.
You needed a
Yeah.
job, you needed to get it done, and
Yeah.
so I think you fulfilled the goals of the AIDS Society by going out and learning those skills and being a self-reliant member of society. And
Well, I think it taught us, both of us, my brother and I speak more for myself, that taught me to realize you had to work very hard. And if you wanted to go anywhere in life, that was going to be your objective, never to be what at times people would refer to you as being lazy. That couldn't be part of your life. From learning on a farm, and there was always work to do. So when you grew up, that you would continue with that ethic that you always had to work hard, and if you were going to go anywhere, that's get a job or whatever, you had to be willing to work hard at it.
you told a story about some of your first days in basic training when you're in the Army,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and some of the fellows were complaining about getting up early. And
yeah. And
tell me
we
that
were
story.
always up very early in the morning, 5:30, and we had, in my case, I ended up out of 5 cows we had to milk by hand. I milked 3 in the morning before breakfast, and you'd go to the house and wash up, dress, and be out, eat your breakfast, and then be out waiting for your bus to take you to school, which it took 2 buses to do that, because you would have to be picked up at the door and taken to another bus, and the bus would then take you to high school. But before that, you normally would take 1 bus to the elementary school. And so it was, when I got in the Army, there were 2 fellows, one on each side of me, complaining about how now they had to get up so early in the morning, and the harshness of how you were treated. You had to do this, and you were maybe yelled at. And I remember turning to each one of them and telling them I had already experienced all of this in my foster home, so this was not going to be difficult for me.
So you already slept in that day, right?
That's it.
Okay. So I was also interested in some of the things they talked about in the movie and the book was a loss of identity when you come, from the city, and they had critics of the orphan train program when it was first beginning and during when it was in effect, was that children were losing their identity when they came from the city and out to wherever they were placed. And there was some criticism from the Catholic Church because they felt like Protestant missionary organizations were taking Catholic children and sending them out to be raised by Protestants in Minnesota or South Dakota. And I asked you about,
Excuse me.
feel like you lost your identity when you came out, but I was really surprised that you kept in touch with your birth mother and your father, and you knew a lot of the history of them, and that was something surprise. I didn't expect that.
More my father than my mother, because my father really, he went out of his way to keep in touch with us and write to us. And there were even times when he would criticize constructively about my writing and how I have to make sure that you get your math, you know. And he would write back to me when we communicated how to correct my writing. And of course that, years later, that's another chapter, that helped an awful lot steering me into improving myself, whether it was writing or anything else. So my dad kept pretty much in touch with us, Christmas and birthdays, and regularly writing to us. Not so my mother. My mother was of a different kind of person, and she had created another life for herself, and so she wasn't as closely in touch with us at all.
So you had explained when we talked about it earlier that you were removed for good reason, you said, from your mom, and you went into your care, and then you were placed out here. And something that I didn't know until today was your trips back to Manhattan to the Children's Aid Society. You had physicals, and was that were they trying to keep you in touch with the people that
I think they probably
relatives, or
encourage that, yeah.
Or just to keep in touch and make sure you're still healthy and still doing well out here?
Once a year they would, we were still property of the, if you want to call it that, property of the Children's Aid Society of New York City. And so the Children's Aid, what we call DSS today, I guess, DD, or whatever, social services, had us have physicals every year and all the necessary shots that we needed. And so that's what we would do every year around Christmas, or after Christmas sometimes. Very rarely, it was always before normally. And then we would go to a center, medical center of sorts, and then receive an extensive physical, and then receive the necessary inoculations that we needed. And then we come back home.
So tell me about that. So do you take a train or you drive in? How do you get down here?
It would be bus.
Bus?
Usually a bus.
And you're accompanied by your stepfather?
Yep. Stepfather would take both of us down there. And then my foster mother would remain at home, and she would, continue the chores. She probably had someone helping out. I never learned about that part, to tell you the truth. And then I think it was maybe a couple of times as we got older, maybe once or twice, my brother and I went by ourselves and then met somebody down there and had the physicals. But most of the time it was my foster father. Then we'd meet up with my father. He'd spend time with us, and a foster relative called Uncle Roy.
Uncle Roy.
And he would come by and he would make a big fuss over us and go to the movies with Dad and myself and my foster father, and go out to dinner, and then we'd stay overnight in a hotel, and Dad would go his way before end of the night, and we'd sleep overnight. Next morning, by noon, we'd be on the bus on our way home.
So what do you know about your father? So
My father,
what's his background?
he had several jobs in his life. I guess he worked for a power company at one time in Long Island, I think, but another time he was a projectionist in the movie theater. That was a union job, and I think he acquired that through one of my uncles, who was head of the projection union in New York City. And then my father ended up in a defense plant on Long Island, and I think it was Sperry.
Okay. And I had asked about earlier when we were speaking about religious background. You said he's
Yeah, the family were originally Jewish. They supposedly, the background, emigrated from Russia, and I think there was some German or whatever other nationalities in there. But the family never really spent a lot of dedication to the Jewish faith. They would probably go to my father's family, I'm speaking of, they would probably go honor some of the high holy days, Jewish days, but I don't think it was any big dedication to the Jewish faith. And then my father never followed it. And I might add that when he married, later on, he married a woman who came from the Irish family, and Evelyn was, I believe she was Presbyterian, and my father followed her in that worship. And by the time my father died, I guess he wasn't a Jew anymore.
Yeah, you mentioned one story that I thought was interesting about practicing Jewish faith in New York City at the time, and since they didn't regularly attend, like when they go for the high holy days, that your dad didn't like sitting in the back.
Right, he didn't. The family had to sit in the back of the synagogue because they weren't as high on the echelon of the synagogue. Only the very wealthy who could afford to pay for the seats in the synagogue got to sit closer to the front. And in my father's situation and family, they didn't have a lot of money. My grandfather worked for the trolley company, and he worked 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It didn't matter what kind of weather, he'd have to operate that trolley in New York City. So he didn't have too much off time to even practice the faith to begin with. So
you mentioned one story that he decided he didn't want to sit in the back.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Tell me about that one.
Approached his father about that. He says, "Why do we always have to sit in the back of the synagogue? Come on, let's go up in the front." And my grandfather slapped him in the mouth and said to him, "Don't you ever bring that question up again. This is where we sit." And my father learned years later he could never figure out why that happened. And then he discovered that it was because they didn't have the money to buy a seat closer to the front. They had to sit in the very back because they were poor Jews.
The reason that I find that interesting, it had to have been a very intensely personal and important memory from your dad, your father, and that you got a chance to hear that from I thought that was an important fact when we were talking before, that you didn't completely lose an identity or where you came from. You're getting bits and pieces of that, and that was interesting.
Yeah, I don't think we lost our identity. My brother may have had different feelings. I don't know. He took a different direction in his life, and that's another chapter. But in my case, I didn't lose my identity. I think I discovered my identity. And
Right.
I might add that identity I attribute to God. He's the one that, and I feel that very strongly. From a very early age, I always felt the presence of God. And even to the point that I had a dream about that. If that's something we talk about later or now, I could.
I think it's uh, from everything we talked about, your connection and relationship with God has come through.
Yes.
So I think it's definitely worth talking about. And you had mentioned before that how old were you when you had this dream?
I'm not sure. I'm going to guess that maybe it was preteen, maybe. I was old enough to know who Christ was. And it was a dream that, in the dream, I was being chased or being threatened by a large group of angry people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was located on the farm. And as I was running away from these people, I turned the corner around one of the farm buildings and was confronted with Christ sitting on a platform, just eye level, with other people with him. And he was all dressed in a very bright, shining robe. And he just very gently held his hand out and he says, "Come, I'll save you. Take my hand." So I did that, got up on the platform with him, and then it just rose a little bit just as these people came around the side of the building, and they all were just dumbfounded by this sight, and they stopped and they stood there with their mouths open, and that pretty much was the end of the dream. It just faded away, and I was saved by grabbing Christ's hand, and I think that's probably very important to me because that's exactly how I relate to my life and everything that happened to me. I think that it's all part of God's plan and the way He moves the pieces on the chessboard. That's how I feel, and I really believe that God has always been there for me, and it wasn't what I did in my life to bring me to this point. I think it's more what God did.
And that is one of the characteristics about knowing you as a personal characteristic of you is kindness that always comes through, and you always seem to be looking after other people.
Try.
You do a pretty good job, and trying is the key. That you're concerned about something bigger, more than yourself, and that Christ has always been the fuel,
Oh, yes.
the thing that makes that possible for you.
Yeah.
To turn your upbringing might have been described as very tough by some people, and some people use those experiences and hold anger, and you have always shown grace and forgiveness and acceptance of people
Yeah.
doing their best.
I tried, yes. I have no bitterness, none. My brother and I were extremely fortunate to have that opportunity and somebody to take us in, strangers. They didn't know what problems that would ensue from two boys. And then there were other factors that affected them that made it more difficult for them by taking in one of their female relatives later on. That really was difficult. So when you look at all these things, I can only be grateful for the outcome and everything that happened to me. And to kind of paraphrase something that we heard in church this morning, God doesn't necessarily create these hardships, but he sure uses them to his good and his outcome. And I think that's what he did with my case, and in a lot of ways my brother's case.
So we're going to say amen to that, and thank you.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.